Ronan was only 10, failing every test despite being a billionaire's son, while his father secretly planned to send him away forever. Every expensive tutor had given up. Every specialist said he was fine. That's when Eliana, their new housekeeper, walked into his room and saw something that made her heart stop. She recognized it immediately because she'd hidden the same devastating secret as a child. What she discovered about Ronan would shatter everything his father believed about his son. And the transformation that followed left everyone speechless. Before we reveal what she discovered, have you ever felt like you were failing someone you love, no matter how hard you tried to help them? What if the answer was right in front of you, but nobody else could see it? If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's continue.
Ronan Mitchell sat in the back row of Mrs. Henderson's fourth-grade classroom at Westfield Academy Prep in Beverly Hills, watching his classmates finish their spelling test with the easy confidence he'd never known. The October morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the polished wooden floors, but all Ronan could see was the chaos of letters swimming before his eyes. "Time's up, children. Please pass your papers forward," Mrs. Henderson announced, her voice bright and cheerful. Ronan stared down at his test paper. Half the words were blank. The other half looked like a foreign language, even though he'd studied them for hours last night. The B in rabbit had somehow become a D, and elephant started with an A instead of an E. His stomach churned as he folded the paper, trying to hide the mess from Tyler and Jackson sitting nearby. "Ronan's probably gonna get another F," Tyler whispered, loud enough for half the class to hear. "My dad says his dad could buy the whole school, but he still can't spell cat." Jackson snickered. Maybe he needs to go back to kindergarten with the little kids. Heat rushed to Ronan's cheeks as he quickly passed his paper forward, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Mrs. Henderson collected the tests with her usual smile, but Ronan caught the slight shake of her head when she glanced at his handwriting. He'd seen that look from every teacher, every tutor, every specialist his father had hired over the past 2 years. The dismissal bell rang, and students rushed toward their waiting cars and nannies. Ronan gathered his superhero backpack slowly, watching through the window as his father's black Tesla pulled up to the curb. Oliver Lawson stepped out, checking his Rolex and scanning the crowd of children with the same intensity he used to evaluate business deals. "There's your dad," Tyler said, shouldering his own bag. "Bet he's gonna be real happy about another failed test." Ronan's hands shook as he zipped up his backpack. He could already imagine the conversation, the disappointed sigh, the cold silence during the drive home, and the inevitable lecture about applying himself and living up to his potential. The words never made sense to him. How could he apply himself any harder when the letters refused to stay in their proper places? Outside, Oliver stood beside the Tesla wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jawline sharp, and his gray eyes held the kind of intensity that made million-dollar deals happen. At 38, he commanded respect in every boardroom from Los Angeles to New York, but when it came to understanding his struggling son, he felt completely lost. "How was school today?" Oliver asked as Ronan climbed into the passenger seat, his voice carrying that careful neutral tone that meant he was bracing for bad news. "Fine," Ronan mumbled, clicking his seatbelt and staring out the window at the palm trees lining Sunset Boulevard. "Did you get your spelling test back?" "Not yet." Oliver glanced at his son through the rearview mirror as they drove through the winding streets of Beverly Hills. Ronan looked so small in the leather seat, his strawberry blonde hair falling across his forehead, his green eyes avoiding contact. The boy had inherited his mother's delicate features and gentle nature, But Oliver sometimes wondered if he'd also inherited her tendency to give up when things got difficult. "Mrs. Henderson called this afternoon," Oliver said finally. "She wants to schedule another conference." Ronan's stomach dropped. Teacher conferences were never good news. They meant more discussions about his learning difficulties and lack of focus, more suggestions for different tutors and study programs that never seemed to help. "I studied really hard, Dad," Ronan said quietly. "I practiced all the words with Maria before she left yesterday." Maria had been their previous housekeeper, a kind woman from Guatemala who'd spent hours helping Ronan with homework. But she'd returned to care for her sick mother 3 weeks ago, leaving another empty space in Ronan's already lonely world. "Studying hard isn't enough, Ronan. You need to study smart. You need to focus and stop making careless mistakes." The word careless hit Ronan like a physical blow. If only his father knew how much care he put into every single letter, how he traced each word with his finger multiple times, how he stayed up past bedtime trying to make the letters behave. But explaining felt impossible when adults never seemed to understand. They pulled through the electronic gates of their Bel Air estate, a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion with manicured gardens and a circular driveway lined with olive trees. The house had 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a movie theater, and an Olympic-sized pool, but to Ronan, it often felt like the loneliest place on earth. "Go wash up for dinner," Oliver said as they entered the marble foyer. "And please try to sit up straight at the table tonight. Posture matters." Ronan nodded and headed upstairs to his bedroom, a space decorated in blues and greens with a reading corner he rarely used and shelves full of books that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. He dropped his backpack on the floor and flopped onto his bed, staring up at the ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead. 3 floors below, in the service entrance near the kitchen, Eliana Fry was just arriving for her first day of work. At 28, she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the weight of recent loss that seemed to follow her everywhere. Her dark skin was smooth and warm, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a crisp white blouse with comfortable black slacks. In her arms, she carried a worn leather satchel that had belonged to her mother. "You must be Eliana," said Mrs. Rodriguez, the head of household staff, greeting her at the door. "Welcome to the Lawson residence. I'll show you around and explain your duties." As they walked through the grand rooms with their marble floors and crystal chandeliers, Mrs. Rodriguez explained the family's routines. "Mr. Lawson is very particular about privacy and efficiency. He works long hours and expects the house to run smoothly. Young Ronan is a sweet boy, but he's been struggling in school lately. Try not to disturb him when he's doing homework." Eliana nodded, listening carefully while her eyes took in the opulent surroundings. The house was beautiful but felt cold, like a museum where people happened to live. Growing up in a small apartment in south-central Los Angeles, she'd never imagined working in a place like this, but the job paid well and came with health insurance she desperately needed. They passed by the living room where family photos lined the mantelpiece. Eliana paused at a large portrait of Oliver and Ronan taken the previous Christmas. The father's smile looked forced, while the boy seemed to be trying to disappear into himself. "His mother?" Eliana asked, noticing the absence of a woman in any recent photos. "Passed away when Ronan was 5, Mrs. Rodriguez said softly. "Car accident. Mr. Lawson doesn't like to talk about it, and the boy barely remembers her. It's been just the 2 of them since then, plus whatever staff we can keep. The position you're filling has been vacant for 3 weeks." Eliana felt a familiar ache in her chest. She understood loss, understood the way it could hollow out a family and leave everyone struggling to connect. Her own mother had died just 6 months ago, leaving behind a legacy of love and a very specific kind of wisdom that Eliana was still learning to carry. The tour continued to the kitchen, a chef's dream with granite countertops and professional-grade appliances. Mrs. Rodriguez explained meal planning, grocery shopping, and the importance of having dinner ready by 7 sharp every evening. Mr. Lawson is very focused on Ronan's education, she added. They've hired tutors, specialists, even a learning consultant, but nothing seems to help. The boy just can't seem to grasp reading and writing the way other children do. Something in those words made Eliana's heart skip. She'd heard similar descriptions before, though not about wealthy children in Beverly Hills mansions. The learning consultant comment especially caught her attention. In her experience, when smart children struggled with reading despite expensive help, there was usually a reason that went deeper than lack of effort. Upstairs, Ronan was attempting his math homework when the numbers started playing the same tricks as the letters. The SIXS kept flipping into 9s, and word problems might as well have been written in code. His pencil snapped from the pressure of his grip, and he threw it across the room in frustration. "This is stupid," he said aloud to his empty bedroom. "I'm stupid." At exactly 7 o'clock, the family gathered in the formal dining room. Oliver sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, scrolling through emails on his phone while Ronan picked at his grilled chicken and vegetables. Eliana served the meal quietly, but she couldn't help noticing the tension that filled the space between father and son. "Put the phone away during dinner, please," Oliver said without looking up from his own device. "You're using yours," Ronan pointed out. "That's different. This is work. My homework is work too." Oliver finally looked up, his gray eyes sharp. "How did homework go today?" Ronan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Okay, I guess." "Just okay. Mrs. Henderson mentioned you've been having trouble completing assignments." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Ronan felt his throat tighten, the familiar sensation of being trapped with no way to explain that the letters and numbers seemed determined to escape from his brain the moment he tried to capture them on paper. "I try really hard, Dad. I promise I do." "Trying isn't enough anymore, Ronan. You're 10 years old. Children your age should be reading chapter books, not struggling with basic spelling words." From the doorway where she was clearing dishes, Eliana watched the interaction with growing concern. She recognized the shame in Ronan's posture, the way he seemed to fold in on himself under his father's disappointment. More importantly, she recognized the signs of a child whose intelligence was being questioned rather than understood. "Maybe if we found a different tutor," Ronan suggested quietly. "Someone who could explain things differently." Oliver set down his fork with more force than necessary. "We've tried 4 different tutors, Ronan. We've had you tested by specialists. Everyone says the same thing. You're bright enough, you just need to focus and stop being so careless with your work." That word again. Careless. Eliana felt something stir in her chest, a memory of her own childhood when teachers used the same word to describe her struggles. Before her mother had figured out what was really happening. "I'm thinking about enrolling you at Brookfield Academy for the spring semester," Oliver continued. "It's a boarding school in Connecticut with an excellent reputation for helping students develop discipline and study habits." Ronan's face went pale. "Boarding school? But I don't want to leave home." "Sometimes what we want and what we need are different things. You need structure and focus that apparently I'm not providing here." Tears began forming in Ronan's green eyes, though he fought hard to keep them from falling. The idea of being sent away felt like confirmation of what he'd suspected all along. He was too broken to be loved, too difficult to be worth keeping around. Eliana set down the plates she'd been clearing and took a deep breath. She knew she was overstepping boundaries, knew she was risking her job on her very first day, but she couldn't stand silent while a child's spirit was being crushed. "Excuse me," she said softly from the doorway. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing. Has Ronan ever been evaluated for learning differences?" Oliver looked up sharply, clearly surprised that the help was inserting herself into a family conversation. "He's been tested extensively. There's nothing wrong with him that better study habits wouldn't fix. What kind of testing? Eliana pressed gently. Intelligence tests, attention assessments, behavior evaluations. The psychologist said he's well within normal range for everything. Eliana nodded slowly. Did anyone specifically test for dyslexia? The word hung in the air like a revelation. Oliver frowned, clearly unfamiliar with the term, while Ronan looked up with curious eyes. What's dyslexia? Ronan asked. Before Oliver could dismiss the question, Eliana found herself stepping fully into the dining room, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. Sometimes the children who need help the most are the ones everyone assumes are just not trying hard enough. It's when very smart brains process letters and words differently than most people, Eliana explained, speaking directly to Ronan. It doesn't mean you're not intelligent. Sometimes it means you're extra intelligent, just in ways that regular school doesn't always recognize. Oliver stood up abruptly. I appreciate your concern, but I think family educational decisions should remain family matters. Eliana felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she also felt her mother's courage flowing through her. Of course, sir. I apologize for overstepping. I just noticed some things that reminded me of. She paused, then decided to take the risk. My mother was a specialist who worked with children who had reading struggles. I grew up around kids who were told they weren't smart enough, when really they just learned differently. Your mother was a teacher? Oliver asked, his tone softening slightly. She was a reading specialist who focused on children with dyslexia. She started the program because... Eliana took a breath. Because I struggled with reading when I was young. Everyone thought I wasn't paying attention, but really my brain just saw letters differently than other people. Ronan was staring at her now with complete attention. The letters moved around for you too? The question hit Eliana like a thunderbolt. Letters moving around. That was exactly how she used to describe it to her mother, back when she was 7 years old and failing every spelling test despite hours of study. Yes, she said quietly, meeting Ronan's eyes. The letters used to dance on the page for me too. Especially B's and D's. They liked to switch places when I wasn't looking. For the first time in months, Ronan smiled. A real, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. Oliver watched this exchange with growing confusion and something that might have been hope. He'd never heard anyone describe Ronan's struggles in a way that made them sound like something other than laziness or defiance. What happened? Ronan asked. How did you make them stop dancing? Eliana glanced at Oliver, asking permission with her eyes. When he nodded slowly, she pulled out a chair and sat down at their level. My mother taught me special ways to see letters and words. She helped me understand that my brain wasn't broken, it was just creative. We practiced with different colors and shapes, and she showed me tricks for catching the letters when they tried to move around. Could you teach me those tricks? Ronan asked, his voice filled with more hope than Oliver had heard in years. Before Eliana could answer, her phone buzzed with a text. She glanced at it quickly, then looked up with regret. I should let you finish your dinner, she said, standing up. This is my first day, and I don't want to create any problems. But as she headed toward the kitchen, she heard Ronan's voice call after her. Will you still be here tomorrow? She turned back to see him looking at her with desperate eyes, as if she might disappear like every other person who tried to help him. I'll be here, she promised. And maybe tomorrow we can talk more about those dancing letters. That night, after Ronan had gone to bed, Oliver stood in his home office overlooking the city lights of Los Angeles. His conversation with Eliana kept replaying in his mind, especially the way Ronan had responded to her description of letters moving around. It was the first time he'd heard anyone make his son's struggles sound like something that could be understood rather than simply overcome through willpower. He picked up his phone and did something he rarely did. He Googled dyslexia symptoms in children. 3 floors up, Ronan lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about dancing letters and the woman who said they'd danced for her too. For the first time in his memory, he felt like maybe he wasn't completely alone in his struggle. Maybe there was someone who could understand what it felt like when your brain wanted to learn but the words wouldn't cooperate. In the small apartment she shared with her elderly aunt in Inglewood, Eliana sat at her kitchen table with her mother's leather satchel open before her. Inside were teaching materials her mother had created over 20 years of working with dyslexic children. Modified alphabets, color-coded reading systems, and handwritten notes about different learning techniques. She'd promised herself she wouldn't get involved in her employer's family dynamics, that she'd keep her head down and do her job quietly. But seeing Ronan's face light up when she described his exact experience, feeling the connection of shared struggle, she knew there was no way she could stand by and watch another child suffer the way she had. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper from the worn pages of her teaching notes. Every child deserves to know they're smart enough. Sometimes we just have to show them a different path to prove it. Tomorrow, Eliana decided, she would find a way to show Ronan that path. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical for late October in Los Angeles. Eliana entered the Lawson mansion at 6:30 sharp, her mother's leather satchel tucked discreetly in her car, but her mind focused entirely on the conversation from the night before. She'd barely slept, replaying Ronan's words about dancing letters and remembering her own childhood struggles with the same mysterious phenomenon. In the kitchen, Mrs. Rodriguez was already preparing Oliver's morning coffee and reviewing the day's schedule. "Mr. Lawson has back-to-back meetings until 4, she explained to Eliana. Ronan gets picked up for school at 7:45 and should be home by 3:15. He usually goes straight to his room to start homework." Eliana nodded, filing away the information while her thoughts remained on the young boy upstairs. She'd researched dyslexia until 2 in the morning, comparing symptoms with her memories of Ronan's behavior at dinner. The way he'd avoided eye contact when discussing school, the frustration in his voice when he mentioned studying hard, the resigned acceptance when his father talked about boarding school. All of it felt heartbreakingly familiar. Upstairs, Ronan was fighting his usual morning battle with getting dressed. His school uniform hung neatly in his closet: navy blazer, white button-down shirt, gray slacks, and a striped tie that always seemed to mock him with its complicated knots. But this morning felt different. The memory of Eliana's understanding words gave him a tiny spark of hope he hadn't felt in months. When he came down for breakfast, Oliver was already seated at the kitchen island, scrolling through financial reports on his tablet while eating steel-cut oats and fresh berries. He wore a charcoal suit with a burgundy tie, his hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. "Good morning, buddy," Oliver said, glancing up briefly. "Did you finish your math homework last night?" Ronan's stomach tightened. He'd attempted the problems for over an hour, but the numbers had played their usual tricks. Addition became subtraction without warning, and word problems might as well have been written in ancient Greek. "I tried, but some of the problems were really hard." "Hard how? Show me what you worked on." Reluctantly, Ronan retrieved his homework from his backpack. The pages were covered with eraser marks, crossed-out numbers, and incomplete solutions. His handwriting looked shaky and uneven, nothing like the neat work his classmates produced. Oliver frowned as he examined the papers. "Ronan, these are basic multiplication facts. We've been practicing these for months. Look at this one. 6 times 7. You wrote 35 instead of 42. "I know 6 times 7 is 42, Ronan said quietly. "But when I was writing it down, the numbers got mixed up somehow." "Numbers don't get mixed up, son. You need to slow down and think before you write." From across the kitchen, Eliana watched this exchange while preparing Ronan's lunch. She noticed how the boy's shoulders sagged with each correction, how his breathing became shallow when his father pointed out mistakes. More telling was the homework itself. The errors weren't random. They followed patterns she recognized from her own childhood and from watching her mother work with dozens of struggling students. 6 times 7 written as 35 wasn't carelessness. It was the classic number reversal that plagued dyslexic children. The handwriting inconsistencies, the eraser marks, the unfinished problems, all pointed to a brain that processed information differently than traditional teaching methods assumed. After Oliver left for his first meeting and Ronan's driver arrived for school, Eliana found herself alone in the house with Mrs. Rodriguez, who was heading out for grocery shopping. This was her chance to look more closely at Ronan's schoolwork, to confirm what her instincts were telling her. She went to Ronan's room, a space that told its own story of academic struggle. His desk was covered with crumpled papers, broken pencils, and textbooks that looked barely used. In his backpack, she found graded assignments from the past week. Every paper was marked with red ink, spelling tests with failing grades, reading comprehension worksheets with unanswered questions, math problems with confused calculations. But as Eliana studied the work more carefully, she began to see intelligence hidden beneath the mistakes. Ronan's incorrect answers often showed creative thinking and logical reasoning. When asked to write about his favorite animal, he'd chosen a dolphin and described their echolocation abilities in sophisticated terms, despite spelling most words incorrectly. His math errors followed consistent patterns that suggested systematic confusion rather than lack of understanding. Most revealing was a writing sample from 2 weeks ago. The assignment had been to describe a perfect day, and Ronan had written about going to the California Science Center with his father. The content was imaginative and detailed, full of scientific curiosity and emotional depth. But nearly every word containing B or D was spelled incorrectly, and his sentences wandered across the page in uneven lines. Eliana sat on Ronan's bed, holding the writing sample, and felt tears gathering in her eyes. She remembered her own 4th-grade writing assignments, remembered the shame of knowing exactly what she wanted to say but being unable to make the letters cooperate. Her mother had kept some of those early papers, evidence of a bright mind trapped behind a learning difference that nobody understood. The sound of the front door opening interrupted her thoughts. She quickly returned Ronan's papers to his backpack and went downstairs, expecting Mrs. Rodriguez returning from shopping. Instead, she found Ronan himself, looking pale and upset. "What are you doing home so early?" Eliana asked, glancing at the clock. It was only 11:30. "I threw up in class," Ronan said, though he looked more embarrassed than sick. "The nurse called my dad, but he was in meetings, so they called a car to bring me home." Eliana suspected the illness might be more emotional than physical. "Are you feeling better now?" Ronan shrugged and headed toward the stairs. "I have homework to catch up on. Mrs. Henderson gave me extra worksheets since I missed the rest of math class." "Wait," Eliana called gently. "Maybe you should rest for a bit first. You just got sick." "I can't rest. If I don't finish these worksheets, I'll get even further behind." The desperation in his voice broke Eliana's heart. She made a decision that would change both their lives. "Ronan, can I ask you something? When you're doing homework, what happens in your brain when you look at the letters and numbers?" He stopped halfway up the stairs and turned around, his green eyes wide with surprise. Nobody had ever asked him that question before. "It's like they're alive," he said slowly. "The letters want to move around, and the numbers switch places when I'm not looking hard enough. Sometimes I know the right answer in my head, but when I try to write it down, something different comes out." Eliana felt her heart racing. This was exactly how she used to describe her own experience to her mother. "Can you show me? Maybe we could work on the worksheets together." 20 minutes later, they sat side by side at the kitchen table, Ronan's math worksheets spread between them. Eliana watched carefully as he attempted the first problem. 4 plus 7 equals? She saw him count on his fingers under the table, saw his lips move as he worked through the calculation, saw him confidently write 11 on the paper. But when she looked at what he'd actually written, the number appeared as 61. "What answer did you write?" she asked gently. Ronan looked down at his paper, and his face crumpled. "I wrote 11, but it came out wrong again. This always happens. I know the right answer, but my hand writes something different." "Look at this," Eliana said, taking a fresh piece of paper. She wrote the number 11, in large, clear digits. "Your brain knew the right answer. Your hand just got confused about which direction the ones should face." She showed him how the two ones in 11 could easily be miswritten as 6 and 1 if the pen moved in slightly different directions. For the first time, Ronan saw his mistake as something logical rather than evidence of his stupidity. "This happens to lots of smart kids," Eliana continued. "Their brains work so fast that their hands can't keep up, and sometimes the information gets scrambled on the way from brain to paper." "Really?" Ronan's voice was barely a whisper. "Other kids have this problem too?" "Absolutely. In fact, some of the smartest people in the world had the same struggles when they were your age. Albert Einstein, Whoopi Goldberg, Tim Tebow. They all had brains that worked differently, and once they learned the right techniques, they became incredibly successful." Ronan stared at her with wonder. "You really think I'm smart?" "I think you're incredibly smart. I think your brain is so creative and active that regular school methods don't work for you. You need different tools, not because you're slow, but because you're special." As they continued working through the math problems, Eliana introduced techniques her mother had taught her. She showed Ronan how to use colored pencils to make numbers more distinct, how to trace letters in the air before writing them, how to cover part of the page to reduce visual distractions. With each small success, Ronan's confidence grew. When he correctly solved 8 plus 6 using Eliana's tracing method, he looked up with the brightest smile she'd seen from him. "It worked! The numbers stayed in the right places." "That's because we found a way to speak your brain's language," Eliana explained. "Your brain is like a really fast computer, but it needs the right software to show its true capabilities." They worked for 2 hours, making more progress than Ronan had made in weeks of traditional tutoring. But more importantly, for the first time in his life, homework felt collaborative rather than punitive. Someone was finally on his side, helping him succeed instead of pointing out his failures. When Oliver returned from his meetings at 4 o'clock, he found them still at the kitchen table, surrounded by completed worksheets and Ronan's genuine laughter as Eliana shared a story about her own childhood struggles with spelling tests. "Dad!" Ronan called out excitedly. "Look what I finished! Eliana showed me special tricks for keeping numbers in line, and I got most of the problems right." Oliver approached cautiously, examining the completed worksheets. The work was neater than usual, the answers mostly correct, and most surprising of all, Ronan looked happy instead of frustrated. "This is excellent work, buddy," Oliver said, genuine surprise in his voice. "How did you manage such improvement?" "Eliana taught me that my brain isn't broken, it just works differently. She showed me how to make the numbers behave." Oliver looked at Eliana with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "What exactly did you do differently?" "I used some techniques my mother developed for children with learning differences," Eliana explained carefully. "Simple modifications that help when traditional methods aren't effective." "And you learned these techniques because you had similar struggles?" "Yes, sir. I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was 7. My mother spent years developing ways to help children like me succeed academically." Oliver was quiet for a long moment, studying his son's proud face, and the evidence of genuine progress spread across the table. Everything he'd been told about Ronan needing more discipline and focus suddenly seemed inadequate compared to what he was witnessing. "Eliana," he said finally, "would you be willing to share more of these techniques? If they're helping Ronan this much in just one afternoon." "I would be honored to help," Eliana replied. "But I think Ronan should also be properly evaluated by a specialist who understands dyslexia. What we accomplished today is just the beginning." That evening, after Ronan had gone to bed clutching his completed homework like a trophy, Oliver sat in his office researching dyslexia evaluations in Los Angeles. For the first time in years, he felt hope that his son's struggles might have a name, a cause, and most importantly, a solution. In her small apartment, Eliana spread her mother's teaching materials across her kitchen table, planning lessons that could unlock Ronan's potential. She thought about her mother's words, "Every child has genius inside them. Sometimes we just need to find the right key." Tomorrow, she would begin showing Ronan that he wasn't broken. He was extraordinary. The next 3 days passed like a carefully choreographed dance between hope and reality. Each afternoon when Ronan returned from Westfield Academy, he would rush to find Eliana, his eyes bright with anticipation for their homework sessions. And each morning, he would leave for school with renewed confidence, only to return deflated by another day of traditional teaching methods that left him feeling stupid and confused. On Thursday afternoon, Ronan burst through the front door looking particularly upset. His backpack hit the marble floor with unusual force, and his school blazer was wrinkled as if he'd been pulling at it all day. "Rough day?" Eliana asked gently, looking up from where she was organizing the pantry. "Mrs. Henderson gave us a pop quiz on multiplication tables," Ronan said, his voice thick with frustration. "I knew all the answers in my head, but when I tried to write them down, everything got mixed up again. Tyler said I must be the dumbest rich kid in California." Eliana felt anger flash through her at the casual cruelty of children, but she kept her voice calm. "Tyler doesn't understand how your brilliant brain works. Did you try any of the techniques we practiced?" "I couldn't. Mrs. Henderson said we had to put our pencils down and start immediately. There wasn't time to trace the numbers in the air or use colors." Ronan slumped against the kitchen counter. "She probably thinks I wasn't paying attention to her lessons." "What did she say when you explained about needing different methods?" Ronan's face flushed red. "I didn't tell her. What if she thinks I'm making excuses? What if she tells my dad I'm trying to get special treatment?" The fear in his voice broke Eliana's heart. Here was a child so conditioned to believe his struggles were character flaws that he was afraid to advocate for his own needs. She knelt down to his eye level, her voice firm but loving. "Ronan, listen to me. Needing different learning methods isn't making excuses. It's being smart about how your brain works best. You wouldn't expect a left-handed person to write with their right hand just because most people are right-handed, would you? I guess not. Your brain is left-handed when it comes to reading and writing. It needs different tools, but that doesn't make it less capable. In fact, dyslexic brains are often more creative and better at solving complex problems than typical brains." Ronan's eyes widened. "Really? Really? But I think we need to talk to your dad about getting you properly tested and maybe speaking with your teachers about accommodations." The hope drained from Ronan's face. "Dad's been really busy this week. He has that big merger happening, and he's been working until midnight every night. I don't want to bother him with more problems." Eliana recognized the pattern. Oliver had indeed been consumed with work since their breakthrough session on Tuesday. He'd left early each morning and returned after Ronan's bedtime, leaving only brief notes about dinner preferences and scheduling. The momentum they'd built was slipping away under the weight of daily routines and competing priorities. "Your education isn't a problem to bother him with," Eliana said carefully. It's the most important thing in your life right now. But what if he decides I'm too much trouble? What if he still sends me to boarding school? The raw vulnerability in that question made Eliana's decision for her. She couldn't wait for perfect timing or proper procedures. This child needed help immediately, before his spirit was completely crushed by a system that didn't understand him. How about this, she said, making a choice that could cost her job. What if we continue working together every day after school, just you and me? We can use my mother's special techniques to help you get stronger at reading and writing. Then, when you're feeling more confident, we can show your dad how much progress you've made. Ronan's whole face lit up. You would do that, even though it's not really your job. Helping smart kids discover their potential is always my job, Eliana said, echoing words her mother used to say. But this has to be our secret for now, okay? Just until we're ready to show everyone how amazing you really are. That evening, after Oliver returned from another late meeting, Eliana approached him carefully. He was in the kitchen, reheating leftover pasta and scrolling through emails on his phone, looking exhausted and tense. Mr. Lawson, I wanted to follow up on our conversation about Ronan's learning evaluation. Oliver looked up, his expression distracted. Right, yes. I've been meaning to research that. This Peterson Industries merger has been consuming all my time, but I'll get to it soon. I could help with the research if you'd like. I know several excellent specialists in the Los Angeles area who work specifically with dyslexic children. That's thoughtful of you, but I prefer to handle educational decisions myself. His tone was polite but firm. I appreciate your concern, but Ronan's schooling is a family matter. Eliana felt the door closing on official help, but she pressed on gently. Of course. I just think the sooner he gets proper support, the better his confidence will be. Confidence comes from achievement, Oliver said, his business mindset taking over. Once Ronan starts applying himself and seeing better grades, his confidence will improve naturally. The fundamental misunderstanding in that statement made Eliana want to scream. Oliver was a brilliant businessman who could see market trends and investment opportunities with laser precision, but he was completely blind to his own son's learning difference. To him, Ronan's struggles were a motivation problem, not a neurological reality. With respect, sir, sometimes children need different approaches to achieve success. What looks like not applying himself might actually be a bright child struggling with methods that don't match how his brain learns. Oliver set down his phone and looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. Eliana, I know you mean well, but I've consulted with educational professionals. Ronan has been tested. There's nothing clinically wrong with him that better study habits and discipline won't solve. But what if the tests didn't look for the right things? What if? I think we should leave educational philosophy to the experts, Oliver interrupted, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in boardrooms. Your job is household management, not academic consulting. The words stung, but they also crystallized Eliana's resolve. If Oliver wasn't ready to hear the truth about his son's needs, she would have to help Ronan build the skills and confidence to advocate for himself. It meant operating in secret, risking her employment, but the alternative was watching a brilliant child lose faith in his own intelligence. Of course, sir. I apologize for overstepping. No need to apologize. I appreciate your care for Ronan's well-being. Just remember that good intentions can sometimes create confusion when they conflict with established plans. That night, Eliana sat in her apartment with her mother's teaching materials spread across her small dining table. She selected the resources that would be most helpful for Ronan's specific challenges. Modified alphabet cards with subtle shape differences, color-coded reading exercises, and math manipulatives that made abstract numbers concrete and manageable. She also pulled out her mother's journal, filled with observations about different students and what techniques worked best for various types of learning differences. Reading her mother's careful notes about patience, creativity, and the importance of building confidence before pushing academic skills, Eliana felt both inspired and anxious about the path ahead. Her phone buzzed with a text from her aunt. "How's the new job going? You've been working late every night this week." Eliana stared at the message, unsure how to explain that she was about to risk everything for a child she'd known less than a week. But when she thought about Ronan's face lighting up when the numbers finally made sense, when she remembered his question about whether other kids had the same struggles, she knew there was no other choice. She texted back, "It's challenging but important work. I think I can really make a difference here." The next morning, Friday, brought unseasonably warm weather to Los Angeles. Ronan left for school wearing a bright blue polo shirt and khaki pants, his confidence boosted by their secret afternoon sessions but still fragile in the face of daily classroom challenges. At Westfield Academy, Mrs. Henderson announced a surprise reading comprehension test. As she distributed the packets, Ronan felt his stomach clench with familiar dread. The pages were dense with small print, the paragraphs seeming to swim before his eyes even before he started reading. "You have 30 minutes to read the passage and answer the questions below," Mrs. Henderson announced. "Begin when you're ready." Ronan looked around the classroom, watching his classmates dive confidently into their packets while he struggled to focus on the first sentence. The words seemed to shift and blur, sentences running together in ways that made no sense. He tried the breathing technique Eliana had taught him, tried to hear her encouraging voice in his head, but the traditional testing format left no room for the accommodations that had been helping him succeed. 20 minutes later, he had barely finished reading the passage, let alone answered any questions. He watched Tyler finish his entire test and start doodling on his desk. Jackson raised his hand to ask for extra paper, apparently writing extensive answers while Ronan sat paralyzed by confusion. When Mrs. Henderson called time, Ronan's paper was mostly blank. He folded it quickly, shame burning in his cheeks, and handed it forward with the same sinking feeling that had become his constant companion at school. During lunch, Tyler approached him at his usual lonely table near the windows. "How do you think you did on the reading test, Ronan?" "Fine," Ronan mumbled, not looking up from his sandwich. "My dad says your dad is thinking about sending you to boarding school. Is that because you can't keep up with regular school?" The words hit like physical blows. Ronan's appetite disappeared completely. "I can keep up just fine." "Then why do you fail every test?" "My mom says some kids just aren't as smart as others, and that's okay, but they shouldn't hold back the kids who are actually good at school." Jackson joined them, sliding his lunch tray onto the table. "My dad says maybe your dad should hire you a full-time tutor instead of sending you away. That way you could get special help without embarrassing the family." Ronan felt tears threatening and excused himself to the bathroom, where he locked himself in a stall and tried to remember Eliana's words about intelligent brains working differently. But surrounded by evidence of his daily failures, her encouragement felt like kind lies told to make him feel better about being fundamentally broken. When he got home that afternoon, Eliana immediately noticed his defeated posture and red-rimmed eyes. "Tough day?" she asked, setting aside the laundry she'd been folding. "The worst," Ronan said, dropping his backpack and collapsing into a kitchen chair. "I failed another test, and the kids are saying Dad wants to send me away because I'm too stupid for regular school." Eliana felt protective fury rise in her chest, but she kept her voice gentle. "First of all, you're not stupid. Second, what kind of test was it?" "Reading comprehension." "But Eliana, I couldn't even understand the passage. All our practice with homework doesn't matter if I can't handle real tests." This was exactly what Eliana had feared. The techniques they'd been practicing were helping Ronan with take-home assignments, but they couldn't address the fundamental issue of classroom accommodations and proper dyslexia support. He needed more than secret tutoring sessions. He needed systemic changes that only official recognition of his learning difference could provide. Ronan, I think it's time we showed your dad how much you've learned with our special techniques. Maybe if he sees your progress, he'll be more open to getting you the help you need at school. But what if he's not? What if he still thinks I'm just making excuses? Eliana made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her phone and opened her notes app, showing Ronan a detailed record she'd been keeping of his daily progress. Homework completion rates, accuracy improvements, confidence indicators, and specific techniques that worked best for different types of assignments. Look at this data, she said. In just 1 week, your math accuracy improved by 60%. Your reading comprehension doubled when we used colored overlays and finger tracking. Your handwriting became legible when we practiced letter formation with tactile materials. Ronan stared at the concrete evidence of his improvement. You kept track of all that? Every single detail. Because I knew that someday, someone would need proof that you're not the problem. The teaching methods are the problem. That weekend would bring the conversation that would determine Ronan's future. Eliana just prayed she could find the right words to help Oliver see what she saw. A brilliant child who needed understanding, not judgment. The foundation was laid. Now came the real test of whether love could overcome ignorance, and whether a father's pride could bend enough to save his son's future. Saturday morning arrived with an unexpected twist that would force the Lawson family into closer quarters than they'd experienced in months. Oliver woke to his phone buzzing frantically at 6 a.m. with news that would derail his perfectly planned weekend. The Peterson Industries merger had hit a major snag, and emergency negotiations were being moved to his home office to maintain absolute confidentiality. Mrs. Rodriguez, Oliver called as he rushed downstairs in his robe. I need you to prepare the conference room for 8 executives arriving at 9 a.m. Full catering, complete privacy, and absolutely no interruptions. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded efficiently, already mentally organizing the massive undertaking. What about Ronan? He usually has soccer practice on Saturday mornings. Oliver paused, realizing he'd forgotten about his son's weekend schedule in the chaos of crisis management. Cancel it. I can't have him running around the house while we're conducting sensitive negotiations. He'll need to stay quiet in his room or the library. 20 minutes later, Eliana arrived for her weekend shift to find the mansion buzzing with activity. Catering staff were setting up in the formal dining room. Mrs. Rodriguez was directing housekeeping to prepare the conference room, and Oliver was pacing through the halls in an expensive suit, barking orders into his phone. Change of plans, Mrs. Rodriguez explained quickly. Emergency business meeting all day. Mr. Lawson needs Ronan kept completely occupied and quiet. No noise, no interruptions, nothing that could disturb the negotiations. Eliana felt a spark of opportunity mixed with nervousness. An entire day of uninterrupted time with Ronan, away from the usual schedule and distractions, could be exactly what they needed to make real progress. But it also meant operating under Oliver's nose while he was already stressed and on edge. She found Ronan in his room, still in pajamas and looking confused about the sudden change in plans. What's happening downstairs? There are people carrying boxes and setting up cameras in Dad's conference room. Your father has an important business meeting today. We need to stay out of the way and keep things quiet. Ronan's face fell. So I'm stuck in my room all day? I was supposed to go to soccer practice with Tyler's team. Coach Martinez said I was finally getting better at passing. The disappointment in his voice tugged at Eliana's heart. Ronan had so few sources of confidence and social connection, and now even those were being curtailed by his father's work demands. Actually, Eliana said, making a decision, I think this could be the perfect day for some special learning adventures. What if we turned your room into a secret classroom and worked on some really exciting projects? What kind of projects? Eliana's mind raced through possibilities that would be engaging but quiet. Well, I brought some of my mother's special materials today. We could explore how your brain works differently from other people's brains, and maybe practice some advanced techniques that could help you feel more confident at school. Ronan's eyes lit up with curiosity. Advanced techniques? Things like memory tricks that use your creativity, math strategies that turn numbers into pictures, and reading methods that make words easier to catch when they try to dance around. For the next hour, while Oliver's business associates arrived and settled into their high-stakes discussions downstairs, Eliana transformed Ronan's bedroom into an innovative learning environment. She spread colorful materials across his desk and floor: textured letter cards, geometric math manipulatives, colored transparency sheets, and her mother's hand-drawn visual aids. "First," Eliana said, sitting cross-legged on the carpet beside Ronan, "I want to show you something amazing about how your brain works." She pulled out a tablet and showed him brain scan images she'd downloaded the night before. These are pictures of dyslexic brains versus typical brains when they're reading. See these bright areas? That's your brain working extra hard and using more creative regions than most people use for reading. Ronan studied the colorful scans with fascination. "My brain really looks different." Not different in a bad way. Different in a spectacular way. Your brain has more connections between the creative and logical sides, which is why you're so good at solving problems and coming up with unique ideas. The challenge is that regular teaching methods don't know how to work with your special brain architecture. This scientific explanation seemed to resonate with Ronan in a way that simple encouragement hadn't. He'd always been curious about how things worked, and understanding his learning struggles as a fascinating neurological difference rather than a character flaw was revolutionary. "So when letters move around for me, that's my brain being extra creative?" Exactly. Your brain is trying so hard to make connections and find patterns that sometimes it gets overstimulated. That's why we need to give it specific tools to channel all that mental energy productively. They spent the next 2 hours exploring techniques that felt more like games than schoolwork. Eliana showed Ronan how to use colored overlays to reduce visual stress while reading, how to create mental movies to remember spelling patterns, and how to use his whole body to practice letter formation through large arm movements. The breakthrough came when they worked on math word problems, historically Ronan's greatest source of frustration. Instead of trying to process the text linearly, Eliana taught him to identify key numbers and operation words first, then build the problem like a puzzle. "Look at this problem," she said, pointing to a worksheet. "Jenny has 24 stickers. She gives away 9 stickers to her friends and buys 15 more. How many stickers does she have now?" Following their new method, Ronan circled the numbers 24, 9, and 15, then underlined "gives away" and "buys more." Within minutes, he'd correctly identified this as subtraction followed by addition and solved it accurately. "I got it right," he exclaimed, then quickly lowered his voice, remembering the need for quiet. "You didn't just get it right," Eliana said proudly. "You understood the strategy. That's much more important than getting one problem correct." Their celebration was interrupted by raised voices from downstairs. Oliver's business meeting was clearly not going smoothly, and the tension was carrying throughout the house. "Should we check on Dad?" Ronan asked, worry creeping into his voice. "I think he needs to focus on his work right now. But you know what? This is actually perfect timing for us to practice something really important." "What's that?" "Concentration skills. When there are distractions and stress around us, can we stay focused on our own goals and keep learning? This is exactly the kind of challenge you might face during a test at school." For the next hour, they practiced reading comprehension exercises while the sounds of heated negotiations drifted up from below. Eliana taught Ronan techniques for creating mental barriers against distraction, ways to use background noise as white sound rather than letting it break his concentration. Around noon, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at Ronan's door looking frazzled. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need Eliana's help. The catering staff mixed up the lunch order, and Mr. Lawson is already upset about the meeting not going well. Could you possibly help me coordinate a replacement meal while I handle the conference room setup?" Eliana looked at Ronan, not wanting to abandon their productive session. "Would you like to come help in the kitchen? We could practice reading skills by helping me organize the catering instructions." 20 minutes later, Ronan found himself reading delivery menus and calculating quantities for 8 business people, using the math strategies they'd practiced that morning. The real-world application made the skills feel immediately relevant and important. "We need sandwiches for 8 people," Eliana said. "The deli offers them in quantities of 6 or 12. Which should we order, and will we have extras?" Ronan worked through the problem systematically, using the visualization techniques they'd practiced. "We should order 12 because 8 people won't fit into 6 sandwiches. That means we'll have 4 extra sandwiches." Perfect reasoning. "And what if we wanted to add drinks?" "Each person needs 1 drink, so that's 8 drinks total." As they worked together to solve the catering crisis, Ronan's confidence grew exponentially. He was using academic skills to handle a real problem, and adults were depending on his calculations. The math that had seemed impossible in classroom worksheets suddenly made perfect sense when applied to concrete situations. Their problem-solving session was interrupted by Oliver appearing in the kitchen, his face tense and his tie loosened from stress. "How's the lunch situation?" he asked Mrs. Rodriguez curtly. "All handled," she replied. "Eliana and Ronan helped me work out the quantities and place the order. It should arrive within 30 minutes." Oliver glanced at his son with surprise. "Ronan helped with calculations?" "He figured out the sandwich quantities and drink numbers perfectly," Eliana said. "He's been practicing some new math strategies today." "Math strategies?" Oliver's attention was momentarily pulled from his business crisis. "What kind of strategies?" Ronan looked up at his father, a spark of pride replacing his usual anxious expression when discussing schoolwork. "Eliana taught me how to find the important numbers first, then figure out what operations to use. It's like solving a puzzle instead of just guessing." Oliver stared at his son, seeing a confidence and enthusiasm about academic work that he hadn't witnessed in years. "Show me." Eliana quickly grabbed a piece of paper and wrote a simple word problem. A bakery makes 48 muffins in the morning and 36 muffins in the afternoon. If they sell 67 muffins during the day, how many muffins do they have left? She handed the paper to Ronan, who immediately began applying their systematic approach. He circled the key numbers, identified the operations needed, and solved the problem correctly within 2 minutes. "That's excellent work, buddy," Oliver said, genuine surprise in his voice. "When did you learn to break down word problems like that?" "Eliana's been teaching me special techniques for how my brain works best," Ronan said. "She says my brain is like a really fast computer that just needs the right software." Oliver looked at Eliana with new interest. "These are the methods you mentioned earlier this week?" "Some of them, yes." Ronan responds particularly well to visual and kinesthetic learning approaches. When we match the teaching method to how his brain processes information, his comprehension improves dramatically. Before Oliver could respond, his phone rang with an urgent call from the conference room. "We'll continue this conversation later," he said, heading back to his meeting. "But Ronan, I'm proud of you for working so hard on new strategies." After Oliver left, Ronan turned to Eliana with excitement. "Did you see his face? He looked actually proud of me for the first time in forever." "He should be proud. You've been working incredibly hard, and you're making amazing progress. Do you think this means he won't send me to boarding school?" Eliana felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The progress they'd made today was real and significant, but it was also just the beginning of what Ronan would need to succeed academically. More importantly, Oliver's brief moment of pride could easily disappear if he didn't understand the systematic support his son required. "I think your dad is starting to see how capable you are," she said carefully. "But we need to keep working together to show him that your struggles aren't about being lazy or unfocused. They're about needing teaching methods that match your learning style." The afternoon stretched ahead of them, full of potential for deeper breakthroughs and growing understanding. But downstairs, Oliver's business meeting continued to deteriorate, and his stress levels were rising with each failed negotiation point. By evening, one crisis or the other would reach a breaking point. The question was whether Ronan's newfound confidence could survive whatever emotional explosion was building in the pressure cooker of their forced proximity. The day that had started as an inconvenience was becoming a catalyst for change, but change in the Lawson household had never come without a fight. By 4 o'clock, the emergency business meeting had devolved into barely controlled chaos. Oliver's voice carried through the mansion's halls as he fought to salvage the Peterson Industries merger, his usual diplomatic tone replaced by sharp frustration. In the kitchen, Eliana and Ronan could hear fragments of heated negotiations about market valuations and shareholder agreements. "Is Dad going to lose his company?" Ronan asked quietly, looking up from the science magazine they'd been reading together. They'd spent the afternoon exploring articles about brain science and learning differences, turning what could have been boring homework into fascinating discovery. "Your father is very good at business," Eliana assured him. "Sometimes important deals require difficult conversations, but that doesn't mean anything terrible will happen." Through the kitchen window, they watched more cars arriving in the circular driveway. Oliver's business partners looked grim as they hurried toward the house, briefcases clutched tightly and phones pressed to their ears. The tension was affecting everyone in the household. "Eliana," Ronan said suddenly, setting down his magazine, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. You said you had trouble reading when you were my age. Were you scared all the time like I am?" The question hit Eliana directly in the heart. She recognized the vulnerability in his voice, the need to know he wasn't alone in his fear and confusion. "I was terrified," she said honestly. "Every day felt like I was drowning in a sea of letters and numbers that everyone else could navigate perfectly. I thought I was the only person in the world whose brain worked wrong." "What changed? How did your mom figure out how to help you?" Eliana had been waiting for this moment, knowing that sharing her full story might be the key to helping Ronan understand his own potential. She pulled out her phone and showed him a photo she'd been carrying since her mother's death. A 7-year-old version of herself, sitting at a small desk surrounded by colorful learning materials, tears of frustration streaming down her face. "This picture was taken during my 2nd year of struggling in school. I just failed another spelling test, and I told my mother I wanted to quit school forever because I was too stupid to learn." Ronan studied the photo intently. "You look exactly like I feel most days. That's because we were fighting the same battle. But look at this." Eliana swiped to the next photo, showing her a year later, proudly holding up a reading certificate, her smile bright and confident. "This was after my mother spent months researching dyslexia and developing new teaching methods specifically for how my brain worked." "She created special methods just for you?" "She started with techniques other specialists had developed, but then she modified them based on what she observed about my specific learning style. Every dyslexic person is different, so the teaching has to be personalized." Eliana opened her mother's leather satchel and pulled out a worn notebook filled with detailed observations and sketches. "This is her journal from when she was learning to help me. Look at these notes." Ronan leaned in close as Eliana read aloud. "Day 15. Eliana still reverses B and D consistently, but today she correctly identified them when I made the letters three-dimensional using clay. Tactile learning may be her strongest pathway. Note: try sandpaper letters tomorrow. She wrote down everything that worked. Everything. Every tiny breakthrough, every technique that failed, every moment of progress. By the time she was done, she had a complete roadmap for helping children with learning patterns similar to mine. Eliana flipped through pages showing detailed drawings of letter formations, color-coding systems, and mathematical manipulatives. Each page revealed her mother's dedication to understanding and solving the puzzle of dyslexic learning. "This is amazing," Ronan whispered, tracing one of the hand-drawn diagrams with his finger. "Your mom was like a scientist studying how to unlock brains." That's exactly what she was. And after she helped me, she went back to school to become a certified learning specialist. For the next 20 years, she helped hundreds of children who were struggling just like we were. Is that why you know so much about teaching kids like me? I learned by watching her work with other families. During summers and weekends, our house was always full of children working with special materials and discovering that they were brilliant in ways their schools didn't recognize. Eliana turned to a section of the journal marked with a red ribbon. These are her notes about the most important principles she discovered. Want to hear them? Ronan nodded eagerly. First principle: never start where the child should be according to their age or grade level. Always start where the child actually is, and build confidence through small, consistent successes. That's what you did with me, Ronan realized. You didn't make me feel bad about not knowing things other fourth graders know. Second principle: intelligence has many forms. A child who struggles with traditional reading may have exceptional spatial reasoning, creative problem-solving abilities, or innovative thinking patterns that schools don't measure. As Eliana continued reading her mother's principles, Ronan felt pieces of his identity shifting and rebuilding. For the first time, his academic struggles were being described as part of a larger pattern of neurological diversity rather than personal failure. Third principle: emotional healing must happen alongside academic remediation. Children who have been told they're lazy or stupid need to rebuild their sense of self-worth before they can fully engage with learning. I never thought about feelings being part of learning, Ronan said thoughtfully. Your emotions and your learning are completely connected. When you feel stupid or ashamed, your brain literally can't access its full capabilities. But when you feel safe and confident, your mind can do incredible things. Their conversation was interrupted by shouting from the conference room. Oliver's voice rose above the others, clearly furious about something that had gone wrong with the negotiations. Maybe we should take a break, Eliana suggested, not wanting Ronan to absorb the negative energy radiating through the house. No, please keep reading. I want to hear more about your mom's discoveries. Eliana continued with her mother's most powerful observation. Fourth principle: every learning difference comes with hidden gifts. Dyslexic children often become exceptional leaders, artists, entrepreneurs, and innovators because their brains naturally think outside conventional patterns. Really? Kids like us become leaders. Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin Airlines, is dyslexic. So is Steven Spielberg, the movie director. Tim Tebow, the football player. Barbara Corcoran from Shark Tank. Whoopi Goldberg. The list goes on and on. Ronan's eyes widened with wonder. They all had trouble reading when they were kids. Most of them struggled terribly in school, but they learned to use their different thinking patterns as superpowers instead of seeing them as disabilities. What kind of superpowers? Eliana flipped to a page where her mother had drawn a diagram comparing typical brain patterns to dyslexic brain patterns. Dyslexic brains are often better at seeing the big picture instead of getting lost in details. They're more creative, better at problem solving, and excellent at understanding how different ideas connect to each other. Is that why the math word problems made sense when I could see the whole pattern? Exactly. Your brain naturally wants to understand systems and relationships, not just memorize isolated facts. The sound of car doors slamming outside indicated that Oliver's business meeting was breaking up. Through the window, they could see his associates walking briskly to their vehicles, their body language suggesting the negotiations had not ended well. "I should probably put these materials away before your father comes in," Eliana said, beginning to gather her mother's journals and teaching aids. "Wait," Ronan said urgently. "There's something I need to tell you first." Eliana paused, hearing the serious tone in his voice. "Last night, I heard Dad on the phone with Brookfield Academy. He wasn't just thinking about sending me to boarding school. He already put down a deposit. I'm supposed to start there in January." The news hit Eliana like a physical blow. January was only 10 weeks away, barely enough time to demonstrate the progress Ronan was capable of making with proper support. "Are you sure that's what you heard?" He said something about structured environment, and removing distractions, and final opportunity for academic improvement. He gave them his credit card number. Eliana felt panic rising in her chest. All their breakthrough work would be meaningless if Ronan was shipped off to an institution that probably knew nothing about dyslexia-friendly teaching methods. Boarding schools like Brookfield were typically focused on discipline and conformity, exactly the opposite of what Ronan needed. "Ronan, this changes everything. We need to show your father your progress immediately, not wait for the perfect moment." "But what if he doesn't believe the techniques really work? What if he thinks you're just being nice to me?" Before Eliana could answer, Oliver appeared in the kitchen doorway. His face was flushed with anger, his expensive suit wrinkled from the long day, and his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it in frustration. "The Peterson deal is dead," he announced to no one in particular. 6 months of work destroyed because their board decided to pursue a hostile takeover instead of a merger. He slumped into a kitchen chair, suddenly looking older than his 38 years. "I'm sorry you had to listen to all that chaos today. Business can be unpredictable." Eliana exchanged a quick glance with Ronan, recognizing this as possibly their only chance to address the boarding school situation, while Oliver's defenses were down from his professional disappointment. "Mr. Lawson," she said carefully, "could we talk about Ronan's academic progress? He's made some remarkable breakthroughs today that I think you should see." Oliver looked up, his business frustration momentarily forgotten. "What kind of breakthroughs?" Ronan took a deep breath, gathering courage from his afternoon of success. "Dad, I solved 20 math word problems correctly today using special techniques Eliana taught me. And I read 3 whole articles about brain science without getting confused." 20 problems? Oliver's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Show me." For the next 20 minutes, Ronan demonstrated the systematic approaches he'd learned for tackling different types of academic challenges. He solved complex word problems, read passages with comprehension, and explained the strategies he was using in clear, confident language. Oliver watched in stunned silence as his son displayed academic capabilities he'd never witnessed before. The child who usually struggled to complete basic homework was now approaching learning with genuine enthusiasm and measurable success. "This is incredible," Oliver said finally. "How is this possible?" Eliana knew this was the moment when everything would either come together or fall apart. She took a deep breath and made the decision to reveal the full truth about Ronan's learning difference and what it would take to help him succeed. "Mr. Lawson, your son isn't lazy or unfocused. He's dyslexic. And with the right support, he can excel academically beyond anything you've imagined." The word hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed or burned. Everything depended on how Oliver chose to respond to this revelation that could change his son's entire future. Oliver stared at Eliana for a long moment, the word dyslexic echoing in his mind like a foreign concept he couldn't quite grasp. His first instinct was to dismiss it, to fall back on the professional assessments that had found nothing clinically wrong with Ronan. But the evidence of his son's academic breakthrough was sitting right in front of him, impossible to ignore. Dyslexic, he repeated slowly, as if testing how the word felt in his mouth. But the educational psychologist said. The educational psychologist tested for attention disorders and general intelligence, Eliana said gently. Those tests don't always identify dyslexia, especially in bright children who've learned to compensate for their struggles. Ronan watched his father's face carefully, trying to read whether this revelation would bring understanding or another round of disappointed lectures about applying himself harder. "Dad," he said quietly, "it doesn't mean I'm broken." Eliana explained that my brain just works differently, like being left-handed in a right-handed world. Oliver looked at his son with new eyes, suddenly seeing the daily courage it must have taken for Ronan to face classroom after classroom of failure without understanding why his best efforts weren't enough. The guilt hit him like a physical blow as he realized how many times he'd attributed his son's struggles to lack of effort or focus. "Can you explain this to me?" Oliver asked Eliana, his usual authoritative tone replaced by genuine vulnerability. "What exactly is dyslexia, and how did I miss it for so long?" Eliana pulled out her mother's journal again, grateful that Oliver was asking questions instead of shutting down the conversation. Dyslexia is a neurological difference that affects how the brain processes written language. It has nothing to do with intelligence. In fact, many dyslexic individuals have above-average intelligence. She opened to a page of her mother's notes about common misconceptions. The reason it often goes undiagnosed is that smart children like Ronan develop coping strategies that hide their struggles. They memorize sight words instead of learning to decode them. They guess at answers based on context clues, and they work twice as hard as their classmates to produce half the results. "That describes Ronan perfectly," Oliver said, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. "He studies for hours but still fails tests. His teachers always said he seemed distracted, but at home I could see how hard he was trying." "The distraction isn't lack of focus," Eliana explained. "It's mental exhaustion from working so much harder than everyone else just to process basic information. Imagine if you had to translate every word from English to French before you could understand it. That's what reading feels like for many dyslexic children." Ronan had been listening intently to this adult conversation about his brain, feeling both relieved and amazed that his struggles finally had a name and explanation. "Is that why letters sometimes look like they're moving around?" "Exactly. Your brain is trying so hard to make sense of the visual symbols that it sometimes sees movement or distortion that isn't really there. It's not your fault, and it's not your imagination." Oliver shook his head slowly, processing years of misunderstanding. "All this time, I thought he just needed more discipline. I was planning to." He stopped himself, suddenly uncomfortable with revealing the boarding school decision. "You were planning to send me away," Ronan finished quietly. "I heard you on the phone with Brookfield Academy." The words hit Oliver like a slap. His son had been carrying the knowledge of impending abandonment while struggling with an undiagnosed learning difference, facing daily academic failure without understanding why. The weight of his parental failures felt crushing. "Ronan, Oliver's voice cracked slightly. "I thought structure and discipline were what you needed. I thought I was failing as a father because I couldn't motivate you to succeed." "You're not failing, Dad. You just didn't know what was really happening." The grace in his son's forgiveness made Oliver's eyes well up with tears he rarely allowed himself to shed. When had his 10-year-old become wise enough to comfort his confused father? "Can we start over?" Oliver asked, his business executive composure completely abandoned. "Can you teach me how to help you the right way?" Eliana felt her heart expand watching this moment of authentic connection between father and son. The most important thing is understanding that Ronan's brain isn't defective. It's creative and innovative. With the right teaching methods, he can not only catch up academically but excel beyond typical expectations. "Show me," Oliver said. "Show me everything." For the next 2 hours, the kitchen became an impromptu classroom where Oliver learned alongside his son. Eliana demonstrated the techniques that had produced such dramatic improvements. Colored overlays that reduced visual stress, multisensory approaches that engaged multiple learning pathways, and systematic methods for breaking complex tasks into manageable steps. Oliver watched in fascination as Ronan tackled reading passages that would have frustrated him just days before. With colored transparency sheets placed over the text and finger-tracking methods to maintain focus, his son read with confidence and comprehension that seemed almost miraculous. "The words aren't dancing anymore," Ronan explained to his father. "When I use the blue overlay and track with my finger, everything stays where it's supposed to be." "This is remarkable," Oliver said, genuinely amazed. "Why isn't this standard practice in schools?" "Many schools are starting to incorporate dyslexia-friendly methods," Eliana explained, "but it takes time for educational systems to change. The most important thing is that Ronan now understands how his brain works and has tools to advocate for himself." Oliver picked up one of the modified alphabet cards Eliana had brought, noting how the letters were slightly thicker and had subtle visual cues that made them easier to distinguish. "These look almost identical to regular letters. The differences are tiny but crucial for dyslexic learners. My mother spent years perfecting these modifications based on how children like Ronan naturally wanted to see letters." As the evening progressed, something beautiful began happening in the Lawson household. For the first time in years, father and son were learning together, sharing discoveries and celebrating small victories without the usual tension around academic performance. Oliver found himself remembering his own childhood struggles with mathematics, how he'd felt stupid and inadequate until a patient teacher helped him understand that he learned better through visual representations than abstract equations. The parallel wasn't exact, but it gave him empathy for his son's experience that he'd never had before. "You know what?" Oliver said suddenly. "I think I might understand a little bit about learning differently. When I was your age, I couldn't grasp math concepts until my teacher started showing me everything with pictures and diagrams." Ronan looked up with surprise. "You had trouble in school too?" "Not the same kind of trouble you've been having, but yes. I felt completely lost until someone taught me in a way that matched how my brain worked." This revelation created a new bond between them, a shared understanding of what it felt like to struggle academically and the relief that came with finding the right approach. "Dad," Ronan said tentatively, "does this mean I don't have to go to boarding school?" Oliver felt shame wash over him as he realized how his son had been living with the fear of abandonment on top of everything else. "Ronan, you're never going to boarding school. I was wrong to even consider it. You belong here with me, getting the support you need to succeed." The relief on Ronan's face was heartbreaking and beautiful simultaneously. "Really? Even if I still struggle sometimes? Especially if you struggle. That's when you need your family most, not when you need to be sent away." Eliana watched this conversation with tears in her eyes, remembering similar moments from her own childhood when her mother's understanding had transformed shame into hope. This was exactly what her mother had meant about healing happening alongside learning. "There's something else," Oliver said, pulling out his phone. "I need to cancel that deposit with Brookfield Academy right now." As he made the call, Ronan turned to Eliana with a smile brighter than any she'd seen from him. "Thank you for helping my dad understand about my brain. Thank you for being brave enough to keep trying even when things felt impossible." When Oliver finished his call, He sat back down at the kitchen table with his son and the woman who had changed their lives in just 1 week. What do we do next? How do we make sure Ronan gets the support he needs? First, we schedule a comprehensive dyslexia evaluation with a specialist who understands learning differences, Eliana said. Then we work with Ronan's school to implement accommodations that match his learning style. And if the school won't cooperate, then we find a school that will. There are educational environments designed specifically for brilliant children who learn differently. Oliver nodded decisively. Money is no object. Ronan gets whatever support he needs, period. The most important support he needs is what he's getting right now, Eliana said softly. Understanding, patience, and belief in his capabilities. As the sun set over Beverly Hills, painting the kitchen in golden light, the three of them continued planning Ronan's educational future. The atmosphere had transformed from tension and misunderstanding to hope and collaboration. Ronan worked on a reading exercise while his father took notes on dyslexia-friendly teaching methods, both of them asking Eliana questions and marveling at how much progress was possible when the right techniques were applied. I have an idea, Oliver said suddenly. What if we converted one of the guest rooms into a proper learning center? Somewhere Ronan could work with specialized materials and tutors who understand his needs. That would be amazing! Ronan exclaimed. Could we have the special lighting Eliana mentioned? And maybe some of those comfortable chairs that help with focus? We'll create the perfect learning environment for your brilliant brain, Oliver promised. For the first time in months, Ronan went to bed that night feeling excited about his academic future instead of dreading it. His father had finally seen his potential instead of just his struggles, and he had an ally who understood exactly how to help him succeed. But even as hope blossomed in the Lawson household, challenges still lay ahead. Systemic change would take time, and not everyone in Ronan's educational world would be as receptive to understanding his differences as his father had become. The real test would come when they tried to implement these changes in the broader world beyond their supportive home environment. Some battles had been won, but the war for Ronan's educational future was just beginning. Seeing someone finally understand your struggles can be life-changing. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that promised change, but the transformation in the Lawson household felt fragile, like a soap bubble that could burst with the slightest pressure. Oliver had spent Sunday researching dyslexia specialists and calling educational consultants, his enthusiasm for helping Ronan almost manic in its intensity. But the real test would come when their private bubble of understanding met the harsh realities of institutional resistance. Ronan left for school that morning carrying more than his usual backpack full of books. He carried hope, fragile and precious, along with a letter from his father requesting a meeting with Mrs. Henderson to discuss newly discovered learning accommodations for my son. The 10-year-old had never felt so supported, but he also had never felt so much riding on a single day. At Westfield Academy, the morning started routinely enough. Ronan took his usual seat in the back row, but for the first time in months, he felt ready to participate rather than hide. When Mrs. Henderson announced a surprise reading quiz, instead of the familiar panic, Ronan felt a spark of confidence. He had tools now, strategies that worked. Please read the passage silently and answer the questions on your worksheet, Mrs. Henderson instructed, distributing the materials with her typical efficiency. Ronan looked down at the dense block of text and felt his stomach clench slightly, but then he remembered Eliana's techniques. He discreetly pulled out a pale blue transparency sheet from his pencil case, the one they'd practiced with over the weekend, and placed it over the reading passage. The effect was immediate and remarkable. The words stopped swimming on the page, the lines of text became distinct and manageable, and for the first time in his academic life, reading felt accessible rather than torturous. Ronan Mitchell, Mrs. Henderson's sharp voice cut through his concentration. What is that blue sheet you're using? Every head in the classroom turned toward him. Ronan felt heat rush to his face as 20 pairs of eyes focused on his adaptation tool. It's a reading overlay. It helps me see the words better. We don't use special materials during assessments, Mrs. Henderson said firmly, walking toward his desk. Please put that away and complete the quiz with the materials provided to everyone else. But it's not cheating, Ronan protested, his voice small but determined. It just helps the letters stay in place so I can read properly. The classroom fell silent except for the whisper of other students continuing their work. Mrs. Henderson stood beside Ronan's desk, her expression a mixture of irritation and confusion. Ronan, you've been in my class for 2 months. If you needed special accommodations, they would have been arranged through the proper channels. Using unauthorized materials during a quiz looks like an attempt to gain an unfair advantage. Tyler looked up from his own completed quiz with a smirk. Maybe he's trying to cheat because he knows he'll fail without help. I'm not cheating. Ronan's voice cracked with emotion. My dad is meeting with you today to explain about my dyslexia. The blue sheet just helps my brain process the words correctly. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose sharply. Dyslexia. Ronan, you were tested at the beginning of the year. There was no indication of any learning disabilities. The tests were wrong, Ronan said, his confidence wavering under the public scrutiny. Eliana explained that smart kids with dyslexia often get missed by regular tests. Who is Eliana? She's. Ronan hesitated, suddenly realizing how complicated it would sound to explain that their housekeeper had diagnosed his learning difference when trained professionals had missed it. The pause was enough for Mrs. Henderson to take control of the situation. Please put the blue sheet away immediately and complete your quiz using standard methods. We'll discuss this supposed diagnosis with your father during our meeting. The dismissive tone in supposed diagnosis hit Ronan like a slap. All the confidence he'd built over the weekend began crumbling as he was forced to attempt the reading passage without his accommodation. The letters immediately began their familiar dance, sentences blurred together, and the comprehension questions might as well have been written in code. By the time he turned in his mostly blank quiz sheet, Ronan felt the old shame returning with crushing force. Maybe Mrs. Henderson was right. Maybe he had been fooling himself into thinking he could succeed with special help that was really just elaborate cheating. The rest of the school day passed in a haze of renewed self-doubt. During lunch, Tyler and Jackson made sure to spread the word about Ronan's cheating attempt with the blue sheet, turning his brave step toward self-advocacy into playground gossip about the rich kid who needed fake tools to keep up with everyone else. My dad says people like that just need to try harder instead of making excuses, Tyler announced loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear. Like, if you can't read without special colored paper, maybe you should be in special education classes. Ronan spent lunch in the library, hiding among the shelves of books that had once felt like enemies but had briefly seemed like potential friends. Now they felt like evidence of his fundamental inadequacy again. Meanwhile, Oliver was experiencing his own reality check in the corporate world. Word of the failed Peterson Industries merger had spread through Los Angeles business circles, and what should have been a routine Monday morning was turning into damage control for his company's reputation. His assistant knocked on his office door at 10:30 with an expression that warned of bad news. Mr. Lawson, I have 3 calls from major clients asking about the stability of our firm. The Peterson situation has some people concerned about our ability to close deals. Oliver felt pressure building behind his eyes. The weekend spent learning about dyslexia and bonding with Ronan had been magical, but the business world didn't pause for personal revelations. His company employed 47 people whose livelihoods depended on his ability to maintain client confidence and secure new contracts. Schedule damage control meetings with Henderson Financial and Brooks Investments, he instructed. And push back my meeting with Ronan's teacher until later this week. I need to handle these client concerns immediately. Should I call the school to reschedule? Oliver hesitated, thinking about Ronan's excitement that morning about finally getting proper support at school. But 3 major clients threatening to pull their accounts could destroy everything he'd built to provide for his son's future. Yes, reschedule for Friday afternoon. And see if you can set up a conference call with the Peterson board members. Maybe we can salvage something from this mess. By noon, Oliver was deep in crisis management mode, fighting to preserve business relationships that had taken years to build. The dyslexia research he'd been doing felt like a luxury he couldn't afford when his company's survival was at stake. At Westfield Academy, Mrs. Henderson waited in her classroom during her lunch break for Oliver's arrival, preparing for what she assumed would be another conversation with an overprotective parent trying to explain away their child's academic struggles. When the school secretary called to say Mr. Lawson needed to reschedule, she felt a mixture of relief and vindication. Typical, she muttered to herself, updating her lesson plans. These parents get emotional about their children's problems, but when it comes to actually following through with meetings, they're always too busy. The secretary added, he asked to reschedule for Friday afternoon. Fine. Mark it down, but don't be surprised if he cancels again. In my experience, parents who make dramatic claims about undiagnosed learning differences usually lose interest when they realize how much work proper support actually requires. When Ronan arrived home that afternoon, his excitement about his father's school meeting had transformed into dread about having to explain why the blue overlay had caused such a scene. He found Eliana in the laundry room, folding clothes with the systematic precision she brought to everything. "How did school go today?" she asked, immediately noticing his slumped shoulders and downcast expression. "Terrible." Mrs. Henderson said the blue sheet was cheating, and she made me put it away during the quiz. Then everyone started saying I was trying to get unfair help because I'm too stupid to read like normal kids. Eliana felt anger flash through her, but she kept her voice calm. Using appropriate accommodations isn't cheating. It's leveling the playing field so your intelligence can show through. But what if she's right? What if I was just fooling myself into thinking those techniques really work? Ronan, did the blue overlay help you read the passage before she made you put it away? Yes, it was amazing. The words were clear and still, and I could actually understand what I was reading. Then it works. The fact that one person doesn't understand the accommodation doesn't change its effectiveness. But Dad was supposed to meet with her today to explain about dyslexia. When I asked the secretary, she said he rescheduled for Friday. The disappointment in Ronan's voice broke Eliana's heart. She could see him interpreting his father's absence as evidence that the weekend's breakthrough hadn't been real, that Oliver's support would evaporate under external pressure. "I'm sure your father had a good reason for rescheduling. Business emergencies happen. Or maybe he decided Mrs. Henderson was right and I was just making excuses. Maybe he realized that the techniques only work because you're being nice to me, not because I'm actually smart." Eliana knelt down to Ronan's eye level, her voice firm with conviction. "Listen to me carefully. Your intelligence is not dependent on other people's understanding or approval. You are brilliant, creative, and capable regardless of what anyone else says or does. Then why does everything still feel so hard? Because changing systems takes time, and not everyone is ready to understand differences they haven't experienced themselves. But that doesn't make your needs less valid or your potential less real." That evening, when Oliver finally arrived home after 12 hours of corporate crisis management, he found Ronan doing homework at the kitchen table with visible frustration. The child who had been excited and confident just 24 hours earlier looked defeated and small. "How was school today, buddy?" Oliver asked, his mind still partially focused on the client retention strategies he'd been developing all afternoon. "You didn't come to meet with Mrs. Henderson," Ronan said quietly, not looking up from his worksheet. Oliver felt guilt hit him like a physical blow. In the chaos of business problems, He'd almost forgotten about the school meeting that had seemed so important just days before. I had to reschedule because of an emergency at work. We'll meet with her on Friday, and everything will get sorted out. She said the blue overlay was cheating. She made me put it away during a quiz, and I failed again. The pain in his son's voice made Oliver realize that his absence had been interpreted as abandonment rather than postponement. Ronan, I'm sorry. I should have been there today. It's okay. Maybe she's right anyway. Maybe I was just imagining that the techniques really worked. Oliver saw his son retreating back into the shell of self-doubt that had taken so much effort to crack open. The weekend's progress felt fragile and threatened, like a house of cards that could collapse with one wrong move. The techniques do work. I saw them work with my own eyes. But if they really worked, wouldn't my teacher understand them? Wouldn't other kids need them too? The questions revealed the depth of Ronan's confusion and returning shame. He was losing faith not just in the accommodations, but in his own perception of their effectiveness. Sometimes adults don't understand things immediately, even when they're true and important. That doesn't make them less real. But even as Oliver said the words, he could feel his own certainty wavering. The business crisis had reminded him of the demands and pressures of the real world, where academic accommodations and learning differences seemed less urgent than client contracts and company survival. Looking at his son's defeated posture, Oliver realized that their weekend breakthrough was in serious jeopardy. The external world was pushing back against their newfound understanding, and both father and son were beginning to doubt whether their private revelations could withstand public scrutiny. The fragile bond they'd built was about to face its greatest test, and neither of them was sure it would survive intact. Tuesday night found Oliver alone in his home office at 11:30, staring at two different documents on his desk. On the left sat a comprehensive dyslexia evaluation request form he'd printed but not yet completed. On the right lay a contract proposal that could save his company but would require him to travel to New York for 2 weeks, missing the rescheduled meeting with Mrs. Henderson and leaving Ronan to face his struggles alone once again. His laptop screen displayed 17 unanswered emails from concerned clients, each one representing thousands of dollars in potential lost revenue. The Peterson merger failure had created a domino effect of doubt about his firm's competence, and vulture competitors were already circling his biggest accounts with promises of more reliable service. Oliver picked up his phone 3 times to call the New York client, each time setting it down before dialing. The rational part of his mind knew this was the opportunity to salvage his business reputation and secure his family's financial future. But the memory of Ronan's face during their weekend breakthrough kept stopping him. Down the hall, Ronan lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying every humiliating moment from school. The blue overlay incident had followed him through every class, with whispered comments about cheating and special treatment, creating a constant background of shame. Even worse, he was beginning to believe them. Maybe Mrs. Henderson was right. Maybe the techniques that had seemed so helpful at home were just elaborate ways of avoiding the hard truth that he wasn't smart enough for regular schoolwork. The weekend's confidence felt like a dream that was fading more each hour. His homework lay unfinished on his desk, not because he hadn't tried, but because attempting it without Eliana's support had revealed how dependent he'd become on her methods. What if he couldn't function without constant accommodation? What if he really was too different to succeed in the normal world? Ronan pulled his pillow over his head, trying to block out the thoughts that were spiraling deeper into self-doubt. He'd heard his father on work calls all evening, the urgency in his voice suggesting that business problems were taking priority over everything else again. 3 floors below, Eliana sat at her small kitchen table in her Inglewood apartment, writing in a journal she'd started keeping about Ronan's progress. But tonight's entry was different from the hopeful observations she'd been recording all week. November 12th, she wrote. Setback at school today. Ronan's accommodation was rejected publicly, causing shame and peer ridicule. Oliver missed scheduled meeting due to business crisis. Both father and son showing signs of losing faith in dyslexia diagnosis and treatment progress. System resistance stronger than anticipated. She paused, pen hovering over the paper as she remembered her mother's words about the most difficult moments in helping struggling children. The real test isn't whether the techniques work. It's whether the family has enough courage to keep fighting when the world pushes back. Eliana closed the journal and reached for her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found Dr. Patricia Williams, a dyslexia specialist her mother had worked with for years. It was nearly midnight, but this couldn't wait until morning. She typed a careful text message. Dr. Williams, this is Eliana Fry, Donna Fry's daughter. I have an urgent situation with a dyslexic child whose family is losing faith in diagnosis due to school resistance and external pressures. Could we talk tomorrow? This child needs immediate advocacy support. The response came within 5 minutes. Of course, dear. I remember your mother's work fondly. Call me at 8 a.m. We'll figure out how to help this child. Wednesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching the mood that had settled over the Lawson household. Oliver left for work before Ronan woke up, leaving only a note saying he might need to travel for business but would try to make Friday's school meeting work. Ronan read the note 3 times, each reading confirming his growing belief that his father's weekend enthusiasm had been temporary. When real-world pressures mounted, supporting his learning differences wasn't a priority anymore. At school, Mrs. Henderson had clearly decided that the previous day's accommodation incident needed to be addressed more formally. She pulled Ronan aside before morning announcements with a concerned expression that felt more condescending than caring. Ronan, I spoke with Principal Carson about your request to use special materials during assessments. We're concerned that allowing these accommodations without proper documentation might set a precedent that could be unfair to other students. But they help me read better, Ronan said quietly. I'm not trying to cheat. I understand you believe that, but we have to consider how it appears to your classmates. If one student gets to use colored sheets and special techniques, others might feel that their scores are being compared unfairly to yours. The logic seemed reasonable on the surface, but it trapped Ronan in an impossible situation. Either he used the tools that helped his brain function properly and faced accusations of cheating, or he attempted schoolwork without accommodations and continued failing. What about my dad's meeting with you? He's going to explain about dyslexia. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly, but not in a reassuring way. Ronan, many parents go through a phase of looking for external explanations when their children struggle academically. It's natural to want to find a reason that doesn't involve personal responsibility. Personal responsibility? Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is help children learn to work harder and develop better study habits instead of looking for excuses about why the work is difficult. The word excuses hit Ronan like a physical blow. Every adult in his life seemed to think his struggles were either character flaws or elaborate attempts to avoid responsibility. Only Eliana had seen them as evidence of a different kind of intelligence that needed different tools. But maybe Eliana was wrong. Maybe she was just being kind to him because that was her job. That afternoon, Ronan came home to find Eliana waiting in the kitchen with an expression of determined purpose that he'd never seen before. Ronan, we need to talk. And I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. He slumped into a chair, preparing for another conversation about staying positive despite evidence that nothing was really changing. This morning I spoke with Dr. Patricia Williams, one of the most respected dyslexia specialists in California. She worked with my mother for 20 years and has helped thousands of children like you. Did you tell her I was making excuses and trying to cheat? The defeat in his voice made Eliana's heart break. I told her about a brilliant child whose intelligence is being questioned by people who don't understand how his brain works. And do you know what she said? Ronan shook his head. She said that what happened to you at school is exactly why proper dyslexia advocacy exists. She said that children like you need adults who will fight for appropriate accommodations, not adults who will fold under the first sign of institutional resistance. But what if the accommodations really are unfair to other kids? Ronan, if you broke your leg, would it be unfair for you to use crutches while other kids walked without them? No, because I would need the crutches to walk properly. Exactly. Your brain needs visual supports to read properly. That's not an unfair advantage. That's appropriate accommodation for a neurological difference. Eliana pulled out her phone and showed him Dr. Williams' credentials. Professor Emeritus at UCLA, author of 3 books on dyslexia, consultant to the California Department of Education on learning difference policies. Dr. Williams wants to meet with you and your father tomorrow afternoon. She's willing to do an emergency consultation and provide documentation that your school will have to respect. But Dad has business problems. He might have to travel to New York. That's his choice to make. But first, I think he needs to understand what's really at stake here. That evening, when Oliver returned from another day of crisis management, he found Eliana waiting in his study with a folder of documents and an expression that brooked no deflection. "Mr. Lawson, we need to talk about Ronan's future. Right now." Oliver sat down heavily, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "Eliana, I appreciate your concern, but I'm dealing with a business crisis that could affect Ronan's entire future. I may lose several major clients if I don't fly to New York tomorrow. And Ronan may lose his entire sense of self-worth if you don't show up for him tomorrow." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Oliver looked at the folder Eliana had placed on his desk, noting the official letterhead of a UCLA Dyslexia Research Center. "What is that?" "Documentation from Dr. Patricia Williams, one of California's leading dyslexia specialists. She's willing to meet with you and Ronan tomorrow afternoon to provide the official evaluation and advocacy support he needs." "I can't. The New York meeting is tomorrow afternoon, and if I don't go, Henderson Financial will definitely pull their account. That's $1 million contract." Eliana took a deep breath, knowing she was about to risk everything but unable to stay silent. "Mr. Lawson, I've watched children like Ronan my entire life. I've seen what happens when their families choose financial priorities over emotional support during critical moments. That's not fair. Everything I do is for Ronan's benefit." "Is it? Or is it for your own fear of business failure?" The question cut deep because it contained a grain of truth Oliver wasn't ready to acknowledge. His drive for financial success had always been motivated by wanting to provide for his family, but somewhere along the way, business achievement had become an identity rather than just a means to an end. "You don't understand the pressures I'm under. I understand that Ronan went to school today and was told his learning differences are excuses for laziness. I understand that he's beginning to believe his teachers instead of believing in himself. And I understand that tomorrow's meeting could change the entire trajectory of his educational future." Oliver stared at the UCLA documentation, seeing his son's name typed on official forms for the first time. The reality of Ronan's dyslexia was becoming impossible to deny, but accepting it meant acknowledging how many times he'd failed to advocate for his child's needs. "If I miss this New York meeting, I might lose the business that pays for Ronan's private school tuition. If you miss tomorrow's meeting with Dr. Williams, you might lose your son's belief that he's worth fighting for." The choice crystallized in that moment with painful clarity. Oliver could protect his business reputation and financial security, or he could protect his son's emotional well-being and educational future. But he couldn't do both. Outside, Los Angeles glittered with the promise of opportunity and success that had always driven Oliver's decisions. But inside his study, a different kind of success was being offered. The chance to be the father his son needed instead of the provider he thought he should be. The phone rang with a call from his assistant about final travel arrangements for New York. Oliver stared at it, his hand hovering over the receiver, while Eliana waited silently for the choice that would determine everything. This was the moment when love would either overcome fear, or fear would win by disguising itself as responsibility. The decision Oliver made in the next 60 seconds would echo through his son's life for decades to come. Oliver stared at the ringing phone for 3 seconds that felt like an eternity. Then, with deliberate precision, he reached over and turned off the ringer. The silence that followed felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. "Cancel my New York trip," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the UCLA letterhead on Dr. Williams' documentation. "Whatever it costs me, my son is worth more." Eliana felt tears of relief gathering in her eyes, but Oliver wasn't finished. "And cancel the rescheduled meeting with Mrs. Henderson for Friday. We're going to meet with Dr. Williams tomorrow, get the documentation Ronan needs, and then we're going to find him a school that understands how brilliant children with dyslexia can be." The transformation in Oliver's voice from defeated businessman to determined father was unmistakable. For the first time since this journey began, he sounded completely certain about his priorities. "Are you sure about the business consequences?" Eliana asked gently. "I spent 10 years building a company to provide for my son's future," Oliver said, standing up with renewed energy. "But what good is financial security if I fail him when he needs me most? Money can be earned back. Trust and self-worth, once lost, are much harder to recover." Oliver picked up his phone and began dialing Dr. Williams' number while Eliana went upstairs to share the news with Ronan. She found him at his desk, staring at blank homework pages with the familiar expression of defeat she'd first witnessed 2 weeks ago. "Ronan, your father has something important to tell you." Before she could explain further, Oliver appeared in the doorway, having taken the stairs 2 at a time in his eagerness to share his decision. "Buddy, I just spoke with Dr. Williams. Tomorrow afternoon, we're going to meet with her so she can officially document what we already know. You're incredibly intelligent, and you learn differently than most people. That's not a problem to solve. It's a superpower to develop." Ronan looked up with cautious hope. "What about your meeting in New York?" "Cancelled. There will always be business meetings, but there's only one chance to show you that you're more important than anything else in my life." The relief that flooded Ronan's face was so profound that Oliver realized how much fear his son had been carrying about being abandoned again, just like when his mother died. This time, when it mattered most, his father was choosing to stay. "Does this mean I don't have to use the techniques in secret anymore?" "It means we're going to make sure every adult in your life understands how your brilliant brain works and what you need to succeed. No more hiding, no more shame, and definitely no more being told you're making excuses." Thursday afternoon at UCLA's Learning Differences Research Center, Dr. Patricia Williams sat across from Ronan and Oliver in an office lined with books about neuroscience and educational innovation. At 62, she had the kind of gentle authority that came from decades of helping children discover their potential. "Ronan," she said, "I want you to know that everything Eliana told me about your experiences matches exactly what I see in many of my brightest students. The fact that you've been compensating so well for so long actually demonstrates exceptional intelligence." For the next 2 hours, Dr. Williams conducted assessments that felt nothing like the previous tests Ronan had endured. Instead of focusing on his deficits, she explored his strengths. His exceptional spatial reasoning, his ability to see patterns and connections that others missed, his creativity in problem-solving. "Oliver," Dr. Williams said during a break while Ronan worked on visual puzzles in another room, "your son's brain is wired for innovation and complex thinking. The challenges he faces with traditional reading and writing are real, but they're minor compared to his cognitive gifts." "So the dyslexia diagnosis is confirmed?" "Absolutely. But more importantly, Ronan falls into the category we call twice exceptional, intellectually gifted and learning different. With proper support, children like him often become leaders in fields requiring creative problem-solving and spatial intelligence. When they rejoined Ronan, Dr. Williams had a folder full of recommendations and a smile that radiated confidence. "Ronan, I have some exciting news. Your testing shows that you're functioning at a gifted level in reasoning and comprehension. The reading challenges you've been experiencing are completely manageable with the right techniques and accommodations." "So I'm not stupid?" "You're the opposite of stupid. Your brain just processes information in sophisticated ways that need different teaching methods. Some of the most successful entrepreneurs, scientists, and artists in the world share your exact neurological profile." Dr. Williams handed Oliver a comprehensive report detailing Ronan's strengths, specific accommodation needs, and recommendations for educational settings that specialized in teaching gifted dyslexic children. "There's a school called Pacific Learning Academy in Santa Monica that would be perfect for Ronan. They use multisensory teaching methods and celebrate different learning styles. I can arrange a visit next week if you're interested." That evening, the three of them sat around the kitchen table planning Ronan's educational future with an excitement that had been absent from homework time for years. Instead of struggling through assignments designed for typical learners, they explored advanced projects that matched Ronan's intellectual curiosity and learning style. "Look at this," Ronan said, showing his father a three-dimensional model he'd built to represent the solar system. "When I make the planets with clay and move them around, I can understand their orbits perfectly. But when I try to read about them in textbooks, nothing makes sense." "That's because you're a kinesthetic learner," Oliver said, using terminology he'd learned from Dr. Williams. "Your brain understands through movement and touch, not just visual symbols." Eliana watched this interaction with deep satisfaction, seeing how father and son were finally speaking the same language about learning and intelligence. 2 weeks later, Ronan started at Pacific Learning Academy, where his blue reading overlays were standard equipment and his need to trace letters in the air was seen as smart self-advocacy rather than disruptive behavior. His first report card showed not just improved grades, but comments from teachers who recognized his analytical thinking and creative problem-solving abilities. Ronan demonstrates exceptional spatial intelligence and shows remarkable insight in mathematical reasoning, his new teacher wrote. When given appropriate accommodations, he consistently produces work that exceeds grade-level expectations. Oliver framed that report card and hung it in his home office next to his business awards, a reminder that his greatest achievement wasn't any corporate success but helping his son discover his own brilliance. The business consequences of choosing family over the New York meeting turned out to be less catastrophic than Oliver had feared. Henderson Financial did pull their account, costing him significant revenue, but his reputation for integrity and family values actually attracted new clients who appreciated working with someone who had clear priorities. More importantly, the crisis had taught Oliver that his identity didn't have to be defined solely by professional achievement. Being Ronan's advocate and champion felt more fulfilling than any business deal he'd ever closed. On a warm December evening, 6 weeks after their first conversation about dancing letters, Eliana sat with Ronan as he worked on a creative writing assignment for his new school. Instead of struggling with basic sentences, he was crafting an imaginative story about a boy who could see mathematical equations in the movements of dolphins. "This is amazing," Eliana said, reading his work. "Look how you're combining science, creativity, and storytelling. This is exactly the kind of thinking that makes dyslexic brains special." "I never thought I could be good at writing," Ronan admitted. "But when I get to tell stories about things I'm interested in, using the computer to check spelling, it's actually fun." Oliver appeared in the doorway, having finished his own evening work earlier than usual. Spending less time on business travel had allowed him to be present for Ronan's homework sessions, something he treasured more than any client dinner. "How's the story coming along?" "Dad, want to hear something cool?" Dr. Williams says that lots of dyslexic people become famous writers because they think about language differently. They see connections and patterns that other people miss. "I believe it. Your stories always surprise me with how creative they are." As Ronan returned to his writing, Eliana gathered her teaching materials, preparing to head home. Her role in the household had evolved from housekeeper to educational consultant and family friend, a transformation that reflected how much all their lives had changed. "Eliana," Oliver said as she reached the door, "I've been thinking about something. How would you feel about going back to school to become a certified learning specialist like your mother?" "I couldn't afford graduate school. What if I sponsored your education?" Ronan isn't the only child who needs an advocate who understands dyslexia from personal experience. You could help hundreds of families avoid the struggles we went through. Eliana felt her mother's presence in that moment, as if 20 years of preparation had led to this opportunity to continue the legacy of helping children discover their hidden brilliance. "I would love that more than anything." 6 months later, Eliana began her graduate studies in educational psychology while continuing to work with the Lawson family. Ronan thrived at Pacific Learning Academy, consistently earning recognition for academic achievement and creative thinking. His confidence had transformed from the fragile hope of a struggling child to the solid self-assurance of a young person who understood his own capabilities. Oliver's business rebounded stronger than before, built on authentic relationships with clients who valued his integrity. But more importantly, his relationship with his son had become the foundation of genuine mutual respect and love. On the anniversary of their first breakthrough conversation, Ronan presented Eliana with a handwritten story dedicated to the person who taught me that different doesn't mean broken, and that every brain has its own special magic. Reading those words, Eliana knew her mother would be proud. They had saved another brilliant child from a lifetime of believing he wasn't smart enough. And in doing so, they had discovered that the most powerful education happens when someone takes the time to understand how a unique mind works. The boy who had once failed every test was now excelling beyond anyone's expectations, not because his brain had changed, but because the world around him had finally learned to see his intelligence clearly. Sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the simplest recognition that struggling doesn't mean stupid, different doesn't mean defective, and every child deserves someone who believes in their potential even when they can't see it themselves. Every child deserves to know they're brilliant in their own unique way. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, wait until you see what's coming next. It's even more powerful and inspiring than you can imagine. So don't go anywhere. Click on that video showing on your screen right now to dive into another amazing story that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't regret it.